Welcome to the Rochester, New Hampshire History Podcast, a monthly show that will shine a light on a piece of history that has been all but forgotten.
In the 1940s, Rochester was profoundly impacted in all phases of life by the Second World War. The city was depleted of young men as they volunteered or drafted into the military. You couldn't purchase as much butter, sugar, meat, or gasoline as you desired. These items and others were rationed, which meant you could only purchase a small amount even if you had the funds to buy more. The government started rationing to ensure that supplies would be available for the military. Everyone did their best not to waste anything, purchase only what was necessary, and share what they had. To increase the nation's food supply, the government turned to its citizens and encouraged them to plant victory gardens. These victory gardens sprung up in backyards and vacant lots in Rochester. After the attack of Pearl Harbor, there was a sense of national panic. The country wondered, could the Japanese launch an attack similar to Pearl Harbor on the Pacific coast? Would the Germans launch an attack on the East Coast? Currently, we can't imagine the United States being attacked by swarms of enemy planes, but in the 1940s it was thought to be a real threat. Seacoast communities like Portsmouth feared they'd be shelled from German ships. What added to these fears was news reports of ships being torpedoed off the coast of cities such as New York, Newport, and Boston. At the beginning of the war, Rochester Mayor Walter Wood created a public safety committee to determine if the city was prepared for an attack. Like most small towns in New Hampshire, the committee determined Rochester was woefully unprepared for 20th century warfare. Ralph Dunlap, a member of the Rochester Fire Department, was sent to Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland for educational courses to prepare the city for war. Returning to Rochester, Mr. Dunlap proceeded to train hundreds of local air wardens about different types of bombs and gases that could be dropped from enemy airplanes. More importantly, he taught first responders how to treat anybody that was exposed to deadly gases or firebombs.
Also, in 1941, Rochester conducted a blackout drill where everybody in the city turned off their indoor and outdoor lights for 70 minutes. If you were driving your car, you would be expected to pull off the side of the road and turn off your headlights. Some citizens used dark blackout curtains in their houses to keep the light inside. The drill was conducted in case the city was subject to an actual enemy air raid. Thought was with no lights displaying, then enemy bombers would not know where to drop their bombs.
2 aerial observation posts were established within Rochester, and volunteers kept a vigilant watch on the skies every day until the war ended. In addition, a warning center was set up that was staffed 24/7 and could communicate with other towns across the state in case a community was attacked. The fire department and police department trained many men to serve as auxiliaries or extras. They'd be used if disaster struck Rochester, and the fire and police departments were overwhelmed.
In October of 1942, Rochester schools collected used clothing for underprivileged children in England and America. This was known as Bundle Day and produced 44 bags and 10 cartons of donated clothing. All of the clothing was shipped to New York for distribution. The Spalding High School senior class was depleted of boys. When the young men reached enlistment age, they joined the military and did not finish high school. More than 50 students left Spalding High School to join the armed forces. Many of these young men received war emergency diplomas. John Cotton, the headmaster of Spalding High School, set up simple criteria for the young men to receive these special diplomas.
The criteria were: seniors in good standing who leave school with the armed services at any time after mid-year shall receive a diploma, and the diploma shall plainly be marked as a war emergency diploma. Shop students at Spalding High School helped the war effort by making miniature military planes. These small planes would be used by armed forces and aircraft identification courses. Students in the domestic art program created kits which would be sent to soldiers serving in the field. At night, the high school shop rooms was used to train workers to work in plants and factories making military goods. Scrap drives were used to obtain much needed material for the war. The weapons of war, such as ships and tanks, required massive amounts of metal. For example, one tank required 17 tons of metal, while a Navy ship could require 800 tons. Any metal item from pots and pans to farm equipment were donated to the scrap drives. Rochester held over 30 scrap drives and hundreds of tons of material were collected. The city lost a bit of history due to these scrap drives. Before the war, there were 4 Civil War cannons that were displayed at the base of the Civil War monument on the Rochester Commons. In 1942, the city donated these cannons to a scrap drive. Rubber was also a valuable commodity. The city held rubber drives so people would bring old rubber items such as raincoats, boots, and hot water bottles. The government used rubber in the production of gas masks, boats, and cars. However, the end result was not good. Even though a lot of rubber was collected, it was of poor quality and hard to use. Paper drives were held. Magazines, newspaper, pamphlets were all donated to the war effort. Paper was needed for packing weapons and equipment, for they were shipped overseas. People were urged to save waste fat and grease and donate them to the government. Recycled fat and grease were used in the production of bombs. In striking contrast to the Depression years of the 1930s, there were a lot of jobs for civilians. Increased defense spending meant that local industries were hiring and doing a lot of business. Local factories were at full employment and full production. For example, Hubbard Shoe in Rochester produced military shoes for the Army and Army Air Force. In fact, 90% of production of Hubbard shoes was for the war effort. Cocheco Woolen and Gonick Manufacturing produced cloth for the military that was used for blankets, uniforms, and parachutes. In addition, if you could not find work in Rochester, the surrounding communities were ripe with employment opportunity. For example, the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard was the state's largest employer in 1945.
We will end the podcast with a moving 1944 speech from Mayor Walter Wood.
They have saved metals, papers, rags, tin cans, and fats. They have contributed their money to varied war relief agencies. They have given generous in their purchase of war bonds. They have given their sons, daughters, husbands, brothers, sisters, and sweethearts. They give their portion of sweat, blood, and tears. They have made the sacrifices they have been called upon to make. I am proud to be an American, a citizen of the state of New Hampshire and the city of Rochester. If you have any comments or suggestions, please email bobgriffinpodcast@gmail.com, and please come back for future episodes of Rochester, New Hampshire History.